Everyone's like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Oh, kids shouldn't be like focused on
Go read a book.
Yeah, go read a book or like go play outside and touch the grass.
A lot of kids on the internet, the parents are usually pulling the strings.
If you're going to focus on training your child to be good at something, it should be general intelligence. Because if you don't know how to learn, you're in trouble.
Baby, welcome to the real world learning environment.
There's kind of like an Asian stereotype where you have Asian kids practicing violin or piano 4 hours a day.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of funny because then once they grow up, the parents are like, no, you can't be a musician. That's how you be homeless and not get any money. So it's kind of like this funny conundrum.
You go from piano or violin as your core focus into lawyer or doctor as your core focus.
Yeah. And I would say
we know this because we're half Chinese.
Yeah. So there's definitely that kind of like, the stand-up comedian Jimmy Yang.
Jimmy Yang
is very funny and talks about some of those Asian stereotypes. And I would say more broadly, a lot of parents will encourage their kids to go into very specific sorts of things because if you practice something very specific over and over and over again,
you're going to get better. You're going to get really good.
Yeah. And so, and then if you start that child at like 2 months at something, then they're going to be even better than other people who might have started when they were 2 years old instead.
And it's really impressive. Like I saw this, I think it was a Britain's Gone Talent or something, but it was a 2-year-old that could do like really, really advanced math, like for a 2-year-old in his head really quickly on stage. And everyone was like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And it's really, really cool. Like it's very captivating of like there's a kid that can do something that sometimes some adults can't do, like especially with these instruments of like playing them really fast and really well. And I think the general perception is that if you start a kid out with this specific thing when they're really young, and they get really good when they're really young, they're going to be way ahead of everyone when they're older.
Yeah.
And
that's not really what's actually
seen.
The case. So that's something that we've seen. We found a Big Think video by this guy, David Epstein, the author of Range, talking about essentially how we want to try to train ourselves to be generalists instead of specialists to prepare for the future, which is very different than the industrial mindset of like, if you just like focus on a really specific niche, then you can be the best in that niche and that's how you can succeed.
Yeah.
And when things are more and more complicated and changing and interconnected, that's just not the case anymore. And I think that that's part of what needs to change about the paradigm when it comes to child development and education and success more broadly, is that you can become, we talked about this in our podcast about how we made a song in 4 hours, and one thing that I said was you can just become exponentially better at exponentially more things if you have general intelligence and you can connect the dots, and that's essentially what he was talking about in terms of being a generalist. And I think one thing you mentioned is like some people might think that we're like child prodigies in terms of just being trained for communication.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's around this idea. I think a lot of kids on the internet have like sort of, the parents are usually pulling the strings of like, oh, look at this kid who does this thing really, really well, when really they're just kind of like not really sure what's going on and just doing what their parents are telling them to do.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like around piano or something where they had been doing it since they were like 3 months old or something. It's like, here's a piano.
Right.
And it's like, I think that I think is the general, is the perception, the assumption people usually jump to when they see, us communicating. We're pretty good at communicating, I'd say so.
Yeah.
Just
a little self-compliment
right there. But I think a lot of people might say like, oh, you're just training your kid to be super good at talking, so
or
that
some people are saying like, oh, you're just training your kid to be like Steve Jobs or something.
Yeah, and it's like, what if they want to go out and have fun outside or something?
Oh yeah, I did. I mean, when I was 11 years old, I did an interview with Pawan Kumar. He's one of the big time YouTubers in the Flutter space, because I was making tutorials for how to code in Flutter for kids, basically a framework developed by Google to build mobile and web applications. And that was something that he picked up on, and some of the comments were just like, oh, kids shouldn't be like focused on
go read a book.
Yeah, go read a book, or like go play outside and touch the grass. And it's like, okay, this is like maybe 10% of what I'm doing.
That's the assumption that they go to is if you're good at something, you're a prodigy. You're someone who has parents that are just trying to get you to do something over and over and over again.
Or it's also something that we're adults, if you're like, for example, when you mentioned that you like cooking, they'll be like, oh, are you going to be a chef when you grow up? When that's like, okay, you spend maybe like, what, 3% of your time cooking, right? Like,
I just like cooking.
Yeah, it's like, that's just an interest of mine, right? That's not my whole entire life, but I think that that's part of what people kind of assume if you're thinking about it from a specialist mindset, from the perspective of this is how you find success, is by niching yourself into a corner and then continuing to do that for the rest of your life and becoming the best in that space. Well, then that's the kind of understanding that you're going to have.
Problems with that, and it's, I think, first I want to define what a prodigy is, and why we aren't. And well, first of all, communication is extremely broad and extremely applicable in different kinds of scenarios. Like you are always going to need to communicate in some way or another. There are different languages for communication in terms of like you can communicate through writing, you can communicate through public speaking, virtual, just recording yourself, or live, you can communicate just one-on-one. You're always going to need to communicate, and I think a big problem with the prodigies is that child prodigies is that you're focusing on something so small and so and it usually has to be objective, like chess or math or something like that.
Well, and they're not even attempting to try to generalize the problem. Like, oftentimes within our family, like if we're talking about a problem, we'll try to generalize and think about a mental model for how can we just more broadly approach problems like this in different sorts of situations. And that's a really important skill in terms of how do you operate in an ever-changing world where there isn't a super clear answer. And this is something that the Big Think video was mentioning, is that you have like kind learning environments where it's very predictable versus like wicked learning environment. I'm not sure of how much I really like these terms, but it's basically like predictable,
maybe welcome
chaotic.
To the real world learning environment.
Well, it's like you can find situations in the real world where it is just like a very simple repeat game,
but it's always some construct around it.
But
like
it's an artificial environment,
a game, a specific instrument. You're just working your way up,
right?
And I think that's what makes a child prodigy a child prodigy, is someone working around something so specific that is so clear, a kind learning environment,
right.
if you would call it, something where you don't actually find a lot of those in the real world and in the world that this world is changing into, something where since it's changing so fast, it's not good to limit yourself to one focus that's so specific that you don't know if you can apply it later on. We're always going to need to communicate, and that's something that's really important. And also, like, people might think we only do this podcast, but we've been doing so many things. Like, we've been doing presentations and live streams. We talk to people,
right?
We do that too. And it's like, that's communication is not just, maybe you could say, oh, they're training for a debate club or something at school.
That's an artificial environment.
That's an artificial environment. But if you're just talking about communication, that's extremely applicable and extremely important.
I think the reason why we've been able to be successful with this is that we are in a generalist's world, in the sense that the reason why we've been able to be successful is that we just have had a ton of different experiences in a ton of different, situations in which, being able to communicate ourselves, when I was 8 years old, communicating myself in terms of like, hey, I can teach your kid coding, versus, a few years later, hey, I'm starting this virtual learning community, versus, I'm starting this platform, and all of those different things where you kind of have to change and adapt. And that's what's missing when it comes to a, kind learning environment, is that it's just, you're creating an artificial environment, and when you go out into the real world where things are changing so fast,
it won't be very kind when you're like you're used to all these kind learning environments where nothing is changing. It's so obvious what you need to do and how you will get there, and you're out to this real, and then you are put out into this real world where it's like, I have so much freedom, I don't know what is valuable,
and one thing
what do I do?
One thing that I think that we've also been talking about is that you do want to be able to have repeat games, in the sense that you're able to continuously do something in a way where you can see your progress and test your environment and get feedback that you can actually rely on. And that's something that is really, really important to be able to do that. We do Taekwondo, and that's something in which it is an artificial environment. There's certain moves that you're supposed to do, and you're supposed to progress through this curriculum, but it's also really helpful in the sense that we can see our progress because it is a consistent environment. And that is really, really important. The problem is we're not only doing Taekwondo and that's our entire life, right? We're also able to, be able to have a lot of those different sorts of repeat games, but also being able to create repeat games out of those like wicked learning environments, right? To create something that is, out of all the things that we could be doing. Part of the reason why it's helpful to do this podcast is that it's something that we're repeatedly doing in a consistent format, so we can actually see ourselves get better and be able to learn from that. So it is really, really important, because if you're just in a completely chaotic environment, it's really hard for you to actually measure or try to test. Part of it is just the accountability, right? Because if let's say we were making videos on a different channel every week, with a different format every week, with maybe different people every week, and that would just be so chaotic. It would be really hard for us to actually know, did we do better this time? Did we do worse this time? How did we do better? So it is really important to have those kinds of environments.
Well, you need to take all the chaotic mess of what you see in the world, and put it into some kind of structure for you to even be able to do anything.
But I think that's also a skill.
The problem, that's the skill. The problem is that if you've just never been exposed to anything but a carefully crafted, specific learning environment where you're just going next step, and you don't even know how to decide anything for yourself, because you've never been exposed to the possibility that you don't know what to do.
Right.
How are you supposed to do anything?
Well, that's a skill in and of itself, is how do I craft a learning environment in which I can actually learn anything,
how do you
out
know
of the
what's
chaos.
Valuable?
And so I think that if you're going to try to focus on training your child to be good at something, it should be general intelligence. It should be learning how to learn, and that's what we're trying to do when it comes to the school, and also humans generally, because if you don't know how to learn, you're in trouble. And we're just seeing that everywhere, because everything's being disrupted all the time by new sorts of technologies coming up, and the rate of change is also growing exponentially, and that's really scary. But it's also it's a great opportunity.